There was an old man who spent 20 years waiting for one sentence. I am sorry. He had heard thousands of words during those 20 years. Excuses, promises, arguments, accusations, and even silence. But he was still waiting for those two words. His name was Marcus. And when people looked at him, they saw a quiet old man who lived alone in a small stone house at the edge of the city. They did not know that behind that quiet face was a story he had carried for most of his life. A story about his son, a story about anger, a story about pride, and a lesson that took him 20 years to understand. Marcus had once been a different man. He was strong, successful, and respected. He owned a small workshop in the center of the city where he made wooden furniture by hand. People came from distant villages just to buy his work. He woke before sunrise, worked until the evening, paid his workers on time, never cheated a customer, and never made promises he could not keep. But there was one thing Marcus valued more than his reputation: his son. His only son was named Elias. Elias was 20 years old when the story began. He was everything Marcus was not. Marcus was patient, Elias was impatient. Marcus thought before speaking, Elias spoke before thinking. Marcus believed a man should build his life slowly. Elias wanted everything immediately. He wanted money, respect, adventure, and recognition. He wanted the world to notice him, and Marcus worried about him, not because he believed his son was weak, but because he knew something his son did not yet understand. The world is very good at rewarding impatience before it punishes it. One evening, Elias came home late. Marcus was sitting beside the fire waiting for him. The room was quiet. Elias entered and threw his coat onto the chair. Marcus looked at him and said, "You were supposed to come home before sunset." Elias ignored him. Marcus waited, then asked, "Where were you?" Elias finally turned around and said, "With friends." Marcus looked at him for a moment and then said, "Living does not mean running away from responsibility." Elias laughed and replied, "You always have something to teach me." Marcus looked back at the fire. Elias continued, "You think because you built a workshop and people respect you that you understand everything." Marcus looked at his son and said, "No, I know I do not understand everything, but I know what regret looks like." Elias shook his head and said, "That is your problem, father. You are afraid of everything." Marcus looked at his son, and for a moment he almost smiled, because he remembered being 20. He remembered thinking his father knew nothing. He remembered believing that experience was simply another word for weakness. So instead of arguing, Marcus said, "Perhaps, but one day you will understand why I warned you." Elias walked away, and that night Marcus believed the argument was over. He was wrong. 3 months later, Elias made a decision that changed both their lives. He borrowed a large amount of money from a wealthy merchant and told him he would return it within 6 months. Marcus found out and immediately warned him, "You cannot repay that amount." Elias said, "I can." Marcus asked, "How?" Elias replied, "I have a plan." Marcus became concerned and tried to speak calmly, but Elias became defensive. "You never believe in me." Marcus replied, "I believe in you. I do not believe in the decision you are making." Elias became angry and said, "You want me to become like you. You want me to spend my whole life in that workshop. You want me to wake up every morning and make chairs until I die." Marcus looked at his son and said, "I want you to build something that cannot disappear overnight." Elias laughed and said, "You are afraid of change." Marcus answered quietly, "No, I am afraid you are confusing change with wisdom." That sentence became the beginning of the end. Elias left the house that night and did not return for 3 days. When he finally came back, he had lost the money. The merchant wanted payment, and Elias had no way to repay him. Marcus was furious, not because of the money, but because he knew what would happen next. The merchant came to the workshop and stood in front of Marcus. "Your son owes me," he said. Marcus looked at him and asked, "How much?" The merchant told him. Marcus could have refused. He could have told the merchant that Elias was an adult and that his son's mistakes were not his responsibility, and technically he would have been right. But Marcus was still a father, so he paid the debt, every last coin. When Elias found out, he did not thank him. Instead, he became angry and said, "You had no right." Marcus stared at him and replied, "No right to save you from a mistake." Elias said, "I did not ask you to." Marcus felt something break inside him. He said nothing. Elias continued, "You always do this. You make me feel like I am a child." Marcus finally answered, "Then stop behaving like one." Elias looked at him with hatred and said something Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "I wish you were not my father." The room became completely silent. Marcus looked at his son. For a few seconds he could not speak. Then he nodded and said, "Go." Elias left. The door closed, and Marcus stood alone in the room. That night he did not sleep. He sat beside the fire until sunrise. He told himself that his son would return. He told himself that anger would pass. He told himself that young people say things they do not mean. But morning came, then another morning, then another. Elias did not return. Weeks passed, then months. Marcus continued working. He never spoke badly about his son. When people asked, he simply said, "He is finding his way." But inside, Marcus was waiting. Every evening he looked toward the road. Every sound outside the workshop made him turn his head. Every knock on the door gave him hope. Maybe this is him. Maybe today he will return. Maybe today he will say, "I am sorry." But the years passed, and the apology never came. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Marcus became old. His hands became weaker. His back became bent. His workshop became smaller. Most of the people who once knew him had died or moved away. But one thing never changed. He still waited. Then one winter morning, a traveler entered the city. He was a middle-aged man wearing an expensive coat. He stopped outside Marcus's workshop and asked, "Are you Marcus?" Marcus looked at him and said, "Yes." The traveler removed his gloves and said, "I knew your son." Marcus stopped moving. "What did you say?" The traveler hesitated and said, "Your son, Elias." Marcus felt his heart begin to race. "Where is he?" The traveler explained that Elias had left the city years earlier. He had traveled from place to place, struggled, eventually built a small business of his own, married, had a daughter, and then illness took him. Marcus sat down. He could not speak. The traveler placed a small wooden box on the table. "Elias asked me to give you this if I ever came back here." Marcus looked at the box. He was afraid to open it. For 20 years he had imagined this moment. He had imagined his son standing at the door. He had imagined hearing his voice. He had imagined saying everything he had kept inside. But his son was dead, and now there was only a box. Marcus opened it. Inside was a small piece of wood carved by hand. It was a simple figure of an old man sitting beside a fire. Marcus stared at it. Underneath the carving were 3 words, "I remember you." Marcus closed his eyes, and for the first time in 20 years he cried. Not because his son had died. He had already died 2 years earlier. He cried because he finally understood. He had spent 20 years waiting for an apology from a man who had spent the last years of his life remembering him. Marcus had been waiting for the wrong sentence. The traveler remained silent. After several minutes, Marcus asked, "Did he ever speak about me?" The traveler nodded. "Often." Marcus looked up. "What did he say?" The traveler said. "He said his father was the hardest man he ever loved." Marcus smiled through his tears. "That sounds like him." The traveler continued, "He also said that he understood you." Eventually, Marcus looked toward the door. The winter sunlight was coming through the window, and suddenly the old man realized something painful. He had spent 20 years waiting to hear the words, "I am sorry," but his son had already said them. Just not to him. And now he understood the cruelty of waiting for an apology. Sometimes the person you want an apology from may never give you one. Sometimes they cannot. Sometimes they will not. Sometimes they do not even understand what they did to you. And if your peace depends on their apology, you have handed them control over your entire life. Marcus had done exactly that. He had allowed a sentence spoken 20 years ago to live inside him every morning, every evening, every birthday, every winter. He had carried those words, "I wish you were not my father." And without realizing it, had allowed his son to remain 20 years old inside his mind. Marcus stood up. He walked to the workshop door and looked at the road. For the first time, he did not wait. He simply watched the morning pass. People walked through the street. Children laughed. A merchant shouted to his workers. A woman carried bread home. Life continued. It had continued for 20 years, and Marcus had been standing still. That afternoon he closed the workshop early. He walked to the hill outside the city. He carried the wooden carving with him. At the top of the hill was an old stone bench. Marcus sat down. He looked at the valley. Then he spoke quietly. "I forgive you." No one answered. He waited. Then he laughed softly because he realized something. He had not said it for Elias. He had said it for himself. The Stoics understood this better than most people. They knew that we cannot control another person's thoughts. We cannot control their words. We cannot control whether they understand our pain. We cannot control whether they apologize. We cannot even control whether they regret what they did. But we can control what we do with the pain they leave behind. That does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not mean allowing people to hurt you again. It does not mean forgetting betrayal. It means refusing to make someone else's mistake the ruler of your future. Marcus had spent 20 years believing forgiveness meant saying that what happened was acceptable. Now he understood. Forgiveness does not say, "You were right." It says, "You no longer control me." There is a difference, a very powerful difference. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for someone else to admit they were wrong. They imagine the apology will heal everything. They imagine one conversation will erase 10 years of pain. They imagine the person will finally understand. And sometimes they do. But sometimes they do not. And if they never do, does that mean you must remain wounded forever? No, your healing cannot depend on another person's maturity. Your peace cannot depend on another person's conscience. Your future cannot depend on someone else's regret. Marcus finally understood this at the age of 70. But there was another lesson waiting for him, one that hurt even more. He realized that he had also been wrong. Not because he had warned his son, not because he had been strict. But because he had believed being right was more important than being close, he had been so determined to protect his son from mistakes that he had forgotten his son needed a father, not a judge. Marcus remembered every conversation, every warning. Every time Elias had tried to speak and Marcus had answered with advice. Every time Elias had wanted freedom and Marcus had responded with fear. Marcus had believed he was teaching wisdom. Perhaps sometimes he had simply been teaching fear. That realization hurt because it meant the story was not as simple as good father, bad son. Life rarely is. People hurt each other, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, sometimes because they are young, sometimes because they are afraid, and sometimes because they simply do not know how to love someone without trying to control them. Marcus sat on the hill until sunset. Then he returned home. The next morning he opened his workshop again, but something had changed. He no longer worked to prove anything. He no longer cared about becoming the most respected craftsman in the city. He simply worked. A young boy began visiting the workshop. His name was Daniel. He was the son of a nearby merchant. He loved watching Marcus carve wood. One morning Daniel asked, "Why do you always work so slowly?" Marcus smiled and said, "Because wood remembers every mistake." Daniel laughed. Then he asked, "Were you always this patient?" Marcus looked at him and said, "No, I had to become patient." Daniel asked, "How?" Marcus looked toward the small wooden carving of the old man beside the fire and said, "By learning that some things cannot be repaired by force." Daniel did not understand, but Marcus did not explain. He had learned something else. Not every lesson needs to be delivered as a speech. Sometimes people must live long enough to understand it themselves. Years passed. Marcus became known for something different. Not his furniture, not his wealth, not his reputation. People came to him when they were angry, when their children had disappointed them, when friends had betrayed them, when someone had broken their trust. And Marcus would listen. He rarely gave immediate advice. Instead, he would ask one question: what part of this is still in your control? Most people hated the question at first because they wanted justice. They wanted the other person punished. They wanted an apology. They wanted the past changed. Marcus understood. But he would ask again, what part of this is still in your control? Eventually they would become quiet, and that quiet was where healing began. One day, an angry young man came to the workshop. Someone had cheated him. He wanted revenge. He wanted Marcus to tell him how to destroy the man's reputation. Marcus listened, then asked, "If you destroy him, will it return what you lost?" The young man said no. Marcus continued, "Will it make you trust yourself again?" The young man remained silent. Marcus asked, "Will it give you back your peace?" Then Marcus said, "Then why are you giving him so much of your life?" The young man looked at him. Marcus continued, "You think revenge means taking something from him, but sometimes revenge is simply refusing to become like him." The young man lowered his head. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way. 20 years, one sentence, one dead son, one wooden carving. That was the price. He wished he had learned it earlier. But Stoicism teaches another difficult truth. Regret itself can become another form of attachment. You can spend your entire life wishing you had acted differently. But yesterday cannot be corrected. Only today can be lived. Marcus could not return to the night Elias left. He could not change the words he had spoken. He could not hold his son again. He could not hear the apology he once desperately wanted. But he could choose what those memories would become, a prison or a teacher. He chose the teacher. And that decision changed the rest of his life. One spring morning, Marcus woke before sunrise. He felt something strange. His body was tired. His breathing was shallow. He knew his time was near. He walked to the workshop. He touched the old wooden table. He looked at the tools he had used for decades. Then he took the small carving Elias had left behind. He placed it beside the window. Sunlight touched it. For a moment, Marcus imagined his son sitting across from him, not as the angry 20-year-old, but as the man he had become, a husband, a father, a man who had finally understood. Marcus closed his eyes and whispered, "I should have listened more." Then he smiled, not because the past had changed, but because he no longer needed it to. That is what peace sometimes looks like. It is not happiness. It is not forgetting. It is not pretending that people did not hurt you. Peace is the moment you stop asking the past to become different before you allow yourself to live. Marcus died peacefully several weeks later. The people of the city remembered him as a wise old craftsman. Some remembered his furniture. Some remembered his advice. But Daniel remembered something else. He remembered the old man's final lesson. After Marcus died, Daniel found a note inside the workshop. It contained only one sentence. "Do not spend your life waiting for someone else to give you permission to be at peace." Daniel kept that note for the rest of his life. And whenever someone betrayed him, whenever someone misunderstood him, whenever someone refused to apologize, he remembered Marcus, the old man who waited 20 years. The old man who finally understood that the apology he needed most was not from another person. It was from himself, for all the years he had spent punishing himself for something he could never change. And perhaps that is the lesson we all need. Because maybe there is someone in your life you are still waiting on. Maybe you are waiting for an apology. Maybe you are waiting for them to admit they were wrong. Maybe you are waiting for them to finally understand how deeply they hurt you. Maybe you believe that once they say those words, you will finally be free. But ask yourself something. What if they never say them? What if they never understand? What if they never become the person you hoped they would become? Will you spend another year waiting? Another 5 years? Another 20? You cannot control another person's heart. You cannot force someone to become honest. You cannot force someone to regret. You cannot force someone to understand your pain. But you can decide what happens next. You can carry the wound, or you can carry the lesson. You can remain angry, or you can become wiser. You can keep asking the past for justice, or you can give yourself permission to move forward. The Stoics never promised that life would be fair. They taught something harder. They taught that your character can remain yours even when life is not fair. Someone may betray you, you can remain honest. Someone may insult you, you can remain dignified. Someone may misunderstand you, you can remain true to yourself. Someone may refuse to apologize. You can still choose peace. That is not weakness. That is freedom. Marcus spent 20 years waiting for someone else to unlock a door, only to discover the door had never been locked. He was the one standing in front of it. And perhaps you are doing the same. Perhaps you are waiting for someone who will never return. Perhaps you are waiting for a message, a phone call, an apology, an explanation, a final conversation. But maybe the final conversation does not need to happen. Maybe you already know enough. Maybe you have already learned enough. Maybe the person who hurt you has already taken enough of your time. Do not give them the rest of your life. Let the past remain where it belongs, behind you. Not because it did not matter, but because you matter too. And if you can learn to live without needing another person to validate your pain, you become very difficult to control. If you can forgive without forgetting, you become stronger. If you can walk forward without receiving the apology you wanted, you become free. And if one day you look back at everything that once destroyed your peace and realize that it no longer controls your heartbeat, then you will understand what Marcus finally understood. Sometimes the greatest victory is not getting the apology. It is reaching the point where you no longer need it. If this story spoke to something you have been carrying quietly, do not rush to forget it. Take the lesson with you. And remember, you cannot control what another person does with their heart, but you can decide what you do with yours.